My daughter-in-law called and announced, "We've sold your beachfront house. Pack up and get out by Monday. The demolition crew is leveling it on Tuesday." Instead of panicking, I asked her one simple question that shut her up instantly. She had no idea her 4 years of greed had just backfired into a fatal mistake, because the old house she schemed so hard to force a sale on was actually just, "I'm so grateful to have you here. Drop a comment below showing where you're watching from your city or country. Also, please note, this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is highly useful." Some betrayals don't arrive with shouting or slammed doors or the dramatic collapse of everything you thought you knew. Some betrayals come quietly. They come on a Monday morning in late October when the fog is still sitting low on Casco Bay and your tea has just reached the perfect temperature, and the only sound in the world is the ocean doing what it has always done. Breathing in, breathing out, completely indifferent to the plans of small and greedy people. Mine came at 8:14 in the morning. I was sitting on the back porch of the Driftwood Cottage, the home my husband Bill and I had built with our own hands on the rocky coastline of Harpswell, Maine, when my phone lit up on the wooden table beside me. The name on the screen made something tighten in my chest. Not surprise exactly, more like the feeling you get when a storm you've been watching from a distance finally decides to make landfall. Bianca, my daughter-in-law, 30 years old, married to my son Richard for 3 years. The woman who had smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table last November and asked with her head tilted just so whether I had ever considered downsizing. I picked up the phone. I kept my voice warm the way I had learned to keep my voice warm across 30 years of teaching high school English in the same county, steady open, giving nothing away before I had to. "Good morning, Bianca. Margaret." She never called me Mom, not once in 3 years. I had stopped noticing. Or maybe I had never stopped noticing and had simply decided not to say anything about it. "I'm glad I caught you. I wanted to give you a heads up before things got moving." I wrapped both hands around my mug. The ceramic was warm against my palms. "What things would those be?" "Richard and I have finalized the sale." Her voice carried that particular brightness, the kind that isn't really warmth at all, but the performance of it. "The Driftwood Cottage. We've accepted an offer. The buyers want possession quickly, so we need you to clear out your personal belongings before Monday. The demolition crew is scheduled for Tuesday morning." The demolition crew. My heart lurched so hard I felt it in my throat. For exactly 3 seconds, the world went sideways. The fog on the bay blurred. The sound of the water became distant and strange, and I felt the particular dizziness of a person who has just been told that something they built with their own hands, something they watched their husband pour 30 years of love into, is scheduled to be knocked down by a crew of strangers on a Tuesday. Then I breathed. One slow breath the way Bill used to remind me. One breath, Maggie. Just one. "Bianca," I said. My voice came out remarkably calm. I was almost proud of it. "Which house do you think I'm calling you from right now?" A pause. Short, but I felt it the first tiny crack in her confidence. "What do you mean you're at the cottage?" "Am I?" I let the question sit there for just a moment, not long enough to be rude, but long enough to be felt. "You go ahead and make your arrangements, sweetheart. We'll talk soon." I ended the call before she could respond. Then I sat there on the porch of the house my husband built, holding my phone in both hands, and I let myself feel it, all of it, the full weight of what had just happened. My eyes burned hot and sudden, the way they do when grief catches you off guard, when you least expect it to find you again. My throat tightened around something that wanted to come out as a sob, but I pressed my lips together and breathed through my nose until it passed. Because here is what Bianca didn't know. Here is what I had not told a single person in this world, except for one, my daughter Chloe, 22 years old, currently in her final year at Boston University School of Law, currently the smartest person I had the privilege of raising. But before I tell you about that, I need to tell you about the safe. Bill Cross. My husband, the man who taught 30 years of high school history in this county, the man who could fix a carburetor and recite the Gettysburg Address from memory and make the best chowder in Harpswell, Maine. Bill was above everything else a man who believed in documentation. Keep the originals. Maggie, he used to say whenever I waved my hand at another folder he was adding to the cabinet. The copies are for them. The originals are for you. I used to roll my eyes. I am not too proud to admit that now. After the call, I stood up from the porch chair, my knees aching the way they have since I turned 58, a small indignity I have come to accept. And I walked through the back door of the cottage, through the kitchen that smelled like morning and cedar, and the particular saltiness that gets into everything when you live this close to the ocean, and I went to the storage room. Bill had poured the concrete floor of that storage room himself on a Saturday in October of 1997. He'd spent the whole day on his knees with a trowel, and I'd brought him sandwiches and coffee, and by evening he'd stood up and put his hands on his lower back and said, "A man's important papers deserve a solid floor under them, Maggie." I had laughed at him. I'd called him sentimental and impractical in the same breath, which was something I did often and which he seemed to regard as a form of affection. He was not wrong. In the back corner of that storage room behind the winter kayak paddles and the extra life vests and the collection of paperback novels that had swelled over 30 years into something approaching a small library sat a gray metal safe, combination lock, 14 inches wide. Bill had bolted it to the concrete floor himself. I knelt down in front of it, my knees protesting the whole way, and I turned the dial. Left, right, left. The same combination we had used since 1997. Bill's birthday backwards. The door swung open. Inside, in a manila envelope that had gone soft with age, were the originals. Every receipt from the lumber yard in Brunswick. Every invoice from the hardware store on Route 1. The concrete purchase. The cedar shingles. The storm-rated window fittings that had cost us 3 times what we'd budgeted for and had kept this house standing through 4 major nor'easters since. Every single piece of paper in Bill's handwriting with Bill's signature on the bottom, stretching from the summer of 1993 to the fall of 1996. I pulled them out carefully. I sat down on the concrete floor, the solid floor Bill had poured for exactly this kind of moment, and I held them in my lap and I cried. Not softly, not politely. My shoulders shook and my face crumpled, and I pressed the envelope against my chest, and I cried the way you cry when the person who used to hold your hand through the hard things has been gone for 5 years, and some mornings the absence of him is so specific and so physical that it feels like a bruise you keep accidentally pressing. "I've got you, Bill," I said out loud to the concrete floor and the life vests and the 30 years of paperback novels. "I've got this." I stayed there for a few minutes. Then I wiped my face on the sleeve of my cardigan, stood up knees and all, and went to get my phone. I had a call to make. Before I tell you who I called, I need to tell you about the man whose name was on every single one of those receipts. William Cross Bill, to everyone who knew him, was not the kind of man who made a big entrance into a room. He was the kind of man you noticed 10 minutes after he arrived when you realized he was the one everyone kept turning toward without quite knowing why. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that were always slightly rough from whatever project he had going on that weekend. He taught history at Harpswell Regional High School for 31 years, and every single June, without fail, at least 3 of his graduating seniors would come find him before the ceremony and shake his hand and say something like, "Mr. Cross, your class changed the way I think." He never got tired of hearing it. His eyes would go bright and a little wet at the corners, and he would grip their hand back and say, "That's all I ever wanted to do." That was Bill. We met in the fall of 1988 at a faculty orientation in Brunswick. I had just been hired to teach English at a middle school 20 minutes away, and the county ran a joint orientation for all new hires. Bill sat 2 seats down from me and spent the entire opening presentation sketching a detailed architectural drawing of what he later told me was his dream house on the back of the agenda sheet. I leaned over and looked at it. "You're an architect?" I asked. He looked up. He had these dark eyes, the kind that seemed like they were paying full attention to you and thinking about something 3 miles away at the same time. "History teacher," he said. "But I've always thought a man should know how to build the things he loves." I thought that was either the most romantic or most impractical thing I had ever heard. I was 26 years old. I married him 14 months later. We were not wealthy people. We were 2 public school teachers in the state of Maine, which meant we drove used cars and packed our own lunches and took our vacations in-state, because in-state was beautiful and free, and the ocean was right there. What we had, we built slowly, carefully, the way Bill approached everything with patience and precision, and absolutely no shortcuts. The land on Casco Bay came in 1993. A small plot on the Harpswell Peninsula, steep drop to the water, $47,000 that felt at the time like every dollar we had ever saved, and several we hadn't. I stood at the edge of that drop-off on the day we signed the papers, looking down at the rocky shoreline, and I said, "Bill, I think we've lost our minds." He stood beside me and looked out at the water for a long moment. Then he reached over and took my hand. "Give it 30 years, he said. I squeezed his hand back. "You better start building then." He laughed that full chest-deep laugh that I have not heard in 7 years, and still reach for in quiet moments the way your tongue reaches for a tooth that isn't there anymore. And the following Saturday morning, he drove to the lumber yard in Brunswick and came back with the first load. Richard was 9 that first summer. He followed his father around the building site with an expression of complete and total reverence, handing Bill nails and holding the measuring tape and asking questions that Bill answered with the seriousness he gave to everything, every measurement, every question, every person who needed his attention. Richard had his father's hands broad-palmed and capable, and Bill used to look at them sometimes with this quiet pride that made my heart feel full to the point of aching. Chloe came 3 years later, born the summer the cottage was finished. We brought her home from the hospital to a house that still smelled like fresh cedar and new paint, and Bill stood in the doorway holding her, this tiny, serious-faced newborn, and looked around at what we had built and said, "This is it, Maggie. This is the whole thing right here." And it was. For 25 years, the Driftwood Cottage was where our family breathed. Every summer, every Thanksgiving, when we could manage it, every long weekend that needed somewhere to reset. Richard and Chloe grew up running on that rocky beach and reading on that back porch and learning to kayak in the cove below the property. We buried our old golden retriever Anchor under the birch tree near the storage room. We hosted Richard's graduation party there. We sat on that porch through 100 summer evenings, Bill and I, after the children were asleep, with the ocean doing its patient work below us, and not needing to say very much at all, because we had the kind of marriage where silence was its own conversation. Then Bill got sick. It started in the winter of 2017, a tiredness that wouldn't lift a cough, that lingered too long a shadow on an x-ray that the doctor called concerning in the careful voice that means something far worse than concerning. By spring, we had a diagnosis. By the following winter, we understood what it meant. I'm not going to dwell on those years in detail because some things belong only to the people who live them. What I will tell you is this: Bill Cross spent the last 2 years of his life refusing, absolutely refusing, to be defined by what was happening to his body. He kept teaching until the semester before he died. He finished building the bookshelves in the cottage living room. He made his famous chowder for Christmas that final year and stood at the stove with his cane propped against the counter and complained that I had bought the wrong kind of clams, which was his way of telling me he loved me. He passed away in October of 2019, on a Tuesday. The cottage was the last place he'd been truly comfortable the previous August. 6 months after we buried him, still raw with grief, still reaching for him in the dark and finding only cold sheets, I did 2 things. The first thing I did was add Richard's name to the deed of the Driftwood Cottage. Richard was our firstborn. He had helped his father lay every plank of that back porch. I thought it was what Bill would have wanted. I thought it was the right thing to do. I was right about Richard. I was catastrophically wrong about the woman he was about to marry. The second thing I did, the thing that nobody knew about except one person on this earth I will tell you about later, First, you need to understand exactly who Bianca Ward was before she became Bianca Cross. Bianca Ward grew up in Portland, the only child of Jasper and Cynthia Ward, two people I will tell you more about shortly, because understanding them is essential to understanding her. Jasper Ward, 58 years old, had spent the better part of his working life as a small-time building contractor in Cumberland County. Not a bad contractor, from what I later learned. He had real skills, real knowledge of how structures went together. The problem was that Jasper Ward also had a weakness for poker games in the back rooms of bars near the waterfront, and that weakness had over the course of 20 years quietly eaten through every dollar he had ever made. By the time Bianca was in her mid-20s, her father owed money to people who did not send polite letters as reminders. Cynthia Ward, 55, was the kind of woman who measured her own worth entirely by the worth of the things around her. She wore clothes that were slightly too expensive for her actual income, drove a car with a lease payment that made no financial sense, and talked about real estate, other people's real estate, with the focused intensity of someone who had spent a long time wanting things she hadn't found a way to get yet. She pushed Bianca from an early age, not toward education or ambition in the traditional sense, toward acquisition, toward finding the shortest possible distance between where they were and where Cynthia Ward believed they deserved to be. Bianca had absorbed every lesson. She was beautiful in a way that was also somehow calculating, the kind of beautiful that is always aware of itself, always working. She had her mother's eye for value and her father's knowledge of property and structures, and somewhere along the way, she had combined these two inheritances into a very specific skill set: identifying assets, identifying the people attached to those assets, and finding the fastest route between the two. Richard met her at a fundraiser in Portland in the spring of 2020. He was 30, then working as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, a career that had delighted Bill, who liked to say that the building gene had skipped a generation and landed squarely in his son. Richard was good-natured, generous to a fault, and constitutionally incapable of believing that people he cared about might not have his best interests at heart. He got that from Bill, too, and I had always considered it one of his finest qualities. Until Bianca. She approached him at that fundraiser. He told me about it afterward. His face lit up the way it hadn't been in years, and I sat across the kitchen table from him and listened and felt, I am ashamed to admit this now, mostly happy for him. He deserved someone. He had been lonely since his last relationship ended 2 years prior, and the loneliness had settled into him in ways I could see, even when he couldn't. She was charming when she needed to be. She asked Richard about his work with the kind of focused attention that made people feel fascinating. She laughed at the right moments. She touched his arm once briefly when he said something about his father, and her eyes went soft in a way that looked like genuine empathy. She was very, very good. It was Chloe who said it first. My daughter came home for Thanksgiving that first year. Chloe was 19 then, in her second year of college, already sharper than anyone in any room she walked into, and she sat beside me at the kitchen counter while Bianca moved around our living room touching things, picking up the framed photos, running her fingers along the mantelpiece, pausing at the window that looked out toward the water with an expression that had nothing to do with admiring the view. Chloe leaned close to me and kept her voice low. "Mom," she said, "look at the way she looks at the house." I looked. "Not at us," Chloe said. "At the house." I felt a cold thread move through my chest. Then I told myself I was being uncharitable, that Chloe was young, and perhaps cynical in the way that very smart young people sometimes are, that Bianca was simply admiring a beautiful home, and I was projecting my own anxieties onto a woman I barely knew. I told myself all of that. I chose to believe it. That was my mistake, and I have thought about it many times since. Richard and Bianca were engaged by Christmas of 2020, married the following September in a ceremony at a venue in Portland that Cynthia Ward had selected and that cost more than Richard made in 3 months. I smiled through the whole day. I danced at the reception. I hugged my son and told him I was happy for him, and part of me meant it completely and part of me kept hearing Chloe's voice in my ear. Not at us, Mom. At the house. In the months that followed the wedding, Bianca began making herself comfortable in the architecture of our family in ways that were difficult to name directly, but impossible not to feel. She started asking questions about the cottage, its square footage, its property tax assessment, whether I had ever had it formally appraised. She framed these questions as curiosity, as the natural interest of a new family member wanting to understand. She was always smiling when she asked them. And then her father, Jasper Ward, started showing up. He came the first time in the spring of 2022, under the pretext of helping Richard fix a drainage issue on their property. He was knowledgeable about construction, I will give him that, and he worked alongside Richard for an afternoon and was perfectly pleasant over dinner. But twice that day, I caught him in the hallway near Bill's study, standing very still looking at the bookshelf where Bill had kept his filing folders. He wasn't reading the spines, he was reading the labels. The second visit was 3 weeks later, then a third. He always had a reason. A tool Richard had borrowed a question about a contractor referral, a bag of clams from the fish market, because Cynthia had bought too many. He was always cheerful, always helpful, always moving through the rooms of our home with the slow, methodical attention of a man taking inventory. By the time I understood what was happening, he had already found what he was looking for. The papers went missing on a Thursday. I discovered it on a Saturday morning when I sat down at Bill's old desk to sort through the property insurance renewal, a task I had been putting off for 2 weeks because sitting at that desk still made my chest ache in ways I had not fully learned to manage. I pulled open the bottom drawer where I kept the property file. I found the folder. I opened it. The copies were there. The summaries, the printed records, the secondary documentation. But the originals, the actual deed transfer paperwork with the county recorder's stamp, the survey documents, the co-ownership amendment I had filed after adding Richard's name, those were gone. Not misplaced, not filed somewhere else. Gone. The folder had been emptied of everything that mattered and restuffed with everything that didn't so carefully that a person not looking specifically for those documents might never have noticed. My hands started shaking so hard I had to put the folder down on the desk. No, I said out loud to the empty room to nobody. No, no, no. I tore through that desk with both hands, pulling drawers open, checking behind folders, lifting stacks of paper. My breath coming in short, panicked bursts, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my ears. I checked the filing cabinet. I checked the bookshelf. I got down on my hands and knees and looked under the desk like a woman who has completely lost her composure, which was exactly what I was. Nothing. I sat back on my heels on the hardwood floor and pressed both hands over my mouth and tried very hard not to completely fall apart. My eyes burned and filled and spilled over before I could stop them. Hot tears running down my face, dripping off my chin, and I let out one ragged, awful sound that I am glad no one was there to hear. Then I remembered what Bill had said. Keep the originals, Maggie. The copies are for them. The originals are for you. I remembered Bill's words, and the realization of what Bianca and Jasper had done hit me like a physical blow. But they didn't know about the gray safe bolted to the concrete floor in the storage room. They didn't know the real originals were untouched. I scrambled to my feet, wiped my face roughly with the back of my hand, and walked straight to the phone. I needed to call my daughter. Chloe answered on the second ring. She was in Boston. I could hear the ambient noise of her apartment, the particular hum of a city. Saturday morning, someone's music faintly through a wall. Mom. Her voice was immediately alert. Chloe had always been able to hear things in my voice that I didn't put there intentionally. What's wrong? Something has happened, I said. I was proud of how steady I sounded. I need you to come home, this weekend if you can manage it. I'm already looking at train times, she said, and I heard the click of her laptop opening. What happened? The deed documents are missing from the house. The originals are safe in Bill's safe, I have them. But someone went through Bill's desk, Chloe. Someone took specific papers and left everything else. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Jasper, she said, not a question. My stomach tightened. I think so. Mom. Her voice dropped, and the sharpness in it was something I recognized. It was the same quality Bill's voice had gotten when he was about to say something that mattered. How long has he been coming around? Since last spring. 14 months. Okay, I'm getting the 4 o'clock train. Don't touch anything else in that desk. Don't call Richard. Don't call anyone until I get there. Can you do that? I taught school for 30 years, I said. I think I can manage 4 hours. She let out a short, fierce laugh, the laugh that was entirely her father's. I love you, Mom. I'll be there by 8. I love you too, baby. My voice cracked on the last word just slightly, and I pressed my lips together hard. I stood up from the floor, tucked the extra copy of the files under my arm, and went to put the kettle on. Chloe was coming home. Before I reveal the shocking showdown at the closing table, drop a "still here" in the comments, so I know you're with me. Also, please note, this narrative features some fictional elements structured for educational purposes and may not be completely factual. If this style doesn't suit you, feel free to close the video right now. But if you're ready for justice, stay tuned. She walked through the front door at 7:53, 7 minutes ahead of schedule with a backpack over one shoulder and her law school laptop bag over the other, and the expression on her face of someone who had spent 4 hours on a train doing research instead of sleeping. Chloe Cross had her father's dark eyes and her father's way of walking into a room like she had already assessed it. She was 22 years old, 5'4", and had been the most formidable person in most rooms since approximately the age of 9. She was in her final year at Boston University School of Law, where her constitutional law professor had apparently told her classmates in front of the entire class that Chloe argued like someone who had been doing it since before she could walk. Bill would have been so proud it would have killed him if something else hadn't gotten there first. She dropped her bags by the door and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and hugged me hard, both arms face pressed against my shoulder, and I held on to my daughter and felt my throat tighten and my eyes go hot and blurry all over again. I'm okay, I said into her hair. I know you are, she said, squeezing tighter. You're the toughest person I know. That doesn't mean I'm not going to hug you anyway. I laughed, and the laugh came out slightly broken halfway between relief and tears, and Chloe pulled back and looked at my face with those sharp, dark eyes, and something fierce and quiet moved across her expression. Tell me everything, she said. From the beginning, leave nothing out. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Bill had graded papers, and I had planned lessons, and Richard and Chloe had done homework on 1,000 school nights, and I told her everything. Jasper's visits, the pattern of them, the way he had moved through the rooms, the missing documents, the safe, all of it in order the way I had organized it in my head during the hours between her call and her arrival. Chloe listened without interrupting once. She had a legal pad open in front of her, and she took notes in the fast, compressed handwriting of someone trained to capture everything, and her face stayed focused and still, except for one moment when I told her about the co-ownership amendment, about adding Richard's name to the deed after Bill died, when her jaw tightened and her pen stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds before she wrote it down. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at me. Okay, she said. Here's what they have. They have copies of documents that show Richard as co-owner. They have whatever Gavin Ross, she had already looked him up on the train, of course she had, whatever that man has been able to fabricate using those copies. And they have Richard's signature on a power of attorney that he almost certainly does not understand the full implications of. My stomach lurched. He signed a power of attorney 3 months ago. Chloe's voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it, banked down like coals. I found it in a county filing while I was on the train. Bianca had him sign it under the description of a financial planning document, something about college funds for the baby. She paused. He thought he was signing paperwork about savings accounts, Mom. She had it buried in 40 pages of documents. The pain that moved through my chest at that was sharp and specific. Not anger, not yet, but something that hurt worse than anger. Something maternal and helpless and furious all at once. My Richard. My generous, trusting, big-hearted boy who had his father's hands and his father's inability to imagine that someone he loved could deliberately deceive him. He didn't know, I said. It wasn't a question. He had no idea. Chloe's eyes went bright for a moment. Not tears, but something close to them, the particular brightness of someone who is very angry and very sad at the same time. He still doesn't know. And Mom, the account the sale proceeds were set up to transfer into. I found that too. She turned her laptop to face me. I looked at the screen. The account was in Cynthia Ward's name, not Richard's, not a joint account, not even Bianca's. Cynthia Ward's private personal account in a bank in Portland. My son was going to be used to sell his father's house, and he was never going to see a single dollar of it. My hands were completely steady when I pushed the laptop back toward Chloe. I was past the shaking. I was past the tears. What was sitting in my chest now was something cold and clear and absolutely certain. "What do we do?" I asked. Chloe smiled, and it was a smile I recognized because I had seen it on Bill's face 100 times in the years when something complex and difficult had suddenly become to his particular way of thinking elegantly simple. "We let them keep going," she said. "We let them get all the way to the closing table, and then," she tapped her legal pad with her pen, "we make one phone call." "To who?" She wrote a name on the legal pad and turned it to face me. "Chief Thomas." My heart lifted so suddenly and so completely that I actually pressed a hand to my sternum in surprise. Dale Thomas, 59 years old, 32 years with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department, and the man who had been Bill's closest friend since the two of them were 19 years old and arguing about baseball in a college dormitory. "He'll listen," Chloe said. "He'll do more than listen," I said. "He loved Bill like a brother." Chloe nodded and reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Then let's go build a lesson plan," she said. Chloe did not sleep that night. I know because I didn't either, and every time I padded down the hallway in my socks to refill my tea, the light under her bedroom door was still burning, and I could hear the soft, rapid clicking of her keyboard, the sound of my daughter dismantling someone else's carefully constructed fraud, one document at a time. By 6 a.m, she was at the kitchen table with 3 empty mugs, a legal pad covered front and back, and the particular bright-eyed exhaustion of someone who has been running on adrenaline and indignation for 8 straight hours. "Sit down, Mom," she said when I appeared in the doorway. "I need to show you some things." I sat. I wrapped my hands around a fresh mug and I looked at my daughter across the table and felt a complicated swell of emotion move through me. Pride so sharp it almost hurt grief for the reason she was here at all, and underneath both of those things, something that was beginning to feel, for the first time since Monday morning, like hope. "Start from the beginning," I said. Chloe turned her laptop to face me and began. Gavin Ross, 35 years old, licensed real estate agent out of Portland, whose license had been flagged twice in the past 4 years for procedural violations that had somehow never escalated to formal disciplinary action, had been Jasper Ward's gambling associate for at least 3 years. Chloe had found their connection through a combination of county court records, a civil debt filing from 2021, and what she described as a Facebook group for recreational poker players in Cumberland County that neither of them thought to make private. "They played cards together every other Wednesday," Chloe said, tapping the screen. "For 3 years. Jasper owed Gavin Ross over $14,000 as of last spring." My mouth went dry. So Gavin Ross had every reason to help Jasper make this work. "Every reason," Chloe confirmed. Her voice was crisp and precise, the way it got when she was in full lawyer mode, but her eyes were hard with something that went beyond professional. "Ross is the one who prepared the fraudulent listing documents. He used the copies Jasper took from your desk to reconstruct a version of the co-ownership paperwork that made it appear Richard had full authority to authorize a sale independently. It's not a sophisticated forgery, Mom. It's actually pretty sloppy. But it was just clean enough to get past a title company that wasn't looking too hard." "Because they weren't expecting to need to look hard," I said. "Exactly." Chloe pulled the legal pad toward her. "Now, the buyers, the Albrights." She said the name with a particular inflection that made me sit up straighter. What about them? Garrison and Evelyn Albright. Chloe spelled it out like she was presenting evidence to a jury, which I realized she was practicing to do. They own a retail development company out of Portsmouth. They've been quietly buying up coastal property in this county for 18 months. 3 purchases so far, all within 2 miles of proposed resort development zones. She looked up at me. The Driftwood Cottage sits on exactly the kind of lot their acquisition pattern suggests they're targeting. They know about the zoning proposal, Mom. They're not buying a vacation home. They're buying an investment. Something shifted in my chest, not quite anger, but close to it. They're paying $380,000 for land they think will be worth 3 or 4 times that once the resort development goes through. At minimum, Chloe said, which means they're motivated to move fast and not ask too many questions. And Bianca knew that. She found buyers who wanted the deal done quickly and quietly, which meant less scrutiny of the paperwork. She paused, and something moved across her face, a flash of reluctant admiration, the way you sometimes feel about an opponent who is genuinely skilled, even when what they're doing is wrong. She's not stupid, Mom. I want to be clear about that. She put this together carefully. She underestimated the receipts, I said. Chloe's face broke into a grin, sudden and real, and so completely her father's that my throat tightened without warning. She underestimated the receipts. She agreed. 30 years of original documentation in Bill's handwriting, proving continuous ownership and maintenance of that property. No forged summary document can override originals, Mom. In Maine property law, the originals win. Every time. I pressed my lips together hard against the emotion that was trying to climb up my throat. Bill, his careful hands and his careful folders and his keep the originals, Maggie. There's one more thing, Chloe said. Her voice shifted softer now and careful in a way that told me I needed to brace myself. I found something about Richard. I breathed in slowly. Tell me. He had no idea the sale money was going to his mother-in-law's account. I went back through his texts when his credit card was compromised last year. He'd added me to his carrier account so I could help monitor the charges. He'd never removed me. I don't think he remembered I still had access. She looked at me steadily. Bianca told him the proceeds would go into a joint account they were setting up for the baby's future. He believed her completely. He talked about it with his friend Marcus in March, said he felt good about finally doing something responsible for his family. The pain that hit me then was the worst kind, the kind that has nothing to do with your own wounds and everything to do with watching someone you love be hurt. My eyes filled so fast I couldn't stop it, and 2 tears ran straight down my face before I could blink them back. He thought he was doing the right thing, I said. My voice came out wrecked. He thought he was being a good father. Yes, Chloe said quietly. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and held it. He did. We sat with that for a moment, the specific grief of it, the particular cruelty of using a good man's love for his child as the instrument of his own betrayal. Then Chloe squeezed my hand, sat up straight, and said, which is exactly why what we do next has to be airtight. For Richard, as much as for you. I wiped my face. I lifted my chin. Then let's make it airtight, I said. Now let me tell you about the property nobody knew existed. 8 years ago, on a Sunday afternoon in late September, Bill and I drove with no destination. We did that sometimes, just got in the truck on a weekend morning with 2 thermoses of coffee and let the coast road take us wherever it wanted. It was one of our best habits, maybe the best one we had. No phones, no agenda, just the 2 of us and the Atlantic and whatever conversation felt worth having that day. Bill was driving. He had the window cracked despite the cold the way he always did because he said he needed to smell the ocean to think clearly. I had my feet up on the dashboard, a habit he pretended to disapprove of and never actually stopped, and we were talking about nothing important. The pleasant, meandering conversation of 2 people who have been married long enough to be comfortable with any topic or none at all. We turned off Route 123 onto a road I didn't recognize, narrow and unpaved, threading between old-growth pine trees so tall and dense they blocked out the afternoon sun entirely. Bill slowed the truck to a crawl. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Not sure yet," he said. He was leaning forward slightly over the wheel, peering ahead, with that focused expression he got when something had caught his attention. "But I want to see what's at the end of this road." What was at the end of that road was a promontory, a wide shelf of granite jutting out over the ocean, 200 feet above the waterline, with a view that stopped the breath clean in your chest. And sitting on that promontory, set back just far enough from the edge to be sensible, was a house. It had been built in the 1920s by someone who understood both beauty and permanence. Stone foundation cedar shingles weathered to silver a wraparound porch that faced southeast and caught the morning light. A decommissioned lighthouse tower rose from the east corner, not tall, perhaps 40 feet, but solid and white and extraordinary against the gray October sky. The whole property had the quality of something that had been standing through storms for 100 years and fully intended to stand through 100 more. A weathered for sale sign leaned against the front gate. Bill stopped the truck. He got out without saying anything. I got out too, and we stood side by side on that granite shelf and looked at the house and then out at the ocean, which was enormous and gray and gorgeous from that height, and neither of us spoke for a long moment because sometimes the right response to something beautiful is to let it be beautiful without filling the space. Then Bill said quietly, "This one, Maggie." I looked at him. His face was turned toward the water and the wind was moving his hair, and he had that expression, the one I had learned over 30 years, meant he was feeling something too large for easy words. "Bill," I said gently, "we can't afford—" "Not yet," he said. He turned to look at me, and his eyes were bright and certain. "But we will. I want us to have somewhere higher to stand Maggie, something that's just ours, something nobody can touch." My heart squeezed so hard I had to press a hand to my chest. I looked at the house. I looked at my husband. I thought about the savings account we had been adding to quietly for 15 years, the one we had always called the someday account, because we never quite agreed on what it was for. "Okay," I said. "Okay, Bill." He smiled that full, unhurried smile that I would have given anything in the world to see one more time. And he took my hand, and we stood on that cliff together until the sun started going down and the cold got serious enough to drive us back to the truck. 3 months later, Bill went to the doctor about a cough that wouldn't go away. We bought the property anyway. I want you to understand that. We bought it after the diagnosis, after we understood what the word prognosis meant in the context of what Bill had, because Bill was absolutely insistent. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him and said, "Maggie, I need to know you have somewhere to stand when I'm gone. I need that more than I need almost anything right now. Please let me do this." So we did it. We used the someday account, every dollar of it, plus the life insurance policy Bill had been paying into since Richard was born, $680,000. Every cent we had set aside across 30 years of packed lunches and used cars and in-state vacations. I named it the Lighthouse Conservation Trust. Chloe, then a sophomore in college, already studying pre-law, agreed to serve as the legal representative of the trust, which meant that on paper, the Clipper Lighthouse had no connection to the name Margaret Cross whatsoever. Bill never saw the final paperwork signed and sealed. He passed 3 years later in October of 2019, but I had shown him the photographs in those final weeks, and he had held my hand and smiled, and that was enough. But I sat beside his bed in those last weeks, and I told him about it, every detail, the stone foundation and the lighthouse tower, and the view that stopped your breath, and he held my hand and closed his eyes and smiled. "Gooding," he said. "That's good, Maggie." Now sitting at the kitchen table with Chloe and her legal pad and 3 empty coffee mugs between us, I told her the rest of it. "The Clipper Lighthouse was appraised last month," I said. "Routine trust administration. You know what the number came back at?" Chloe looked up from her notes. "How much?" $1.2 million. Her pen stopped moving. Her eyes went wide, genuinely wide, the surprise of a person who had not seen that coming, and then she pressed both hands flat on the table and let out a breath that was half laugh and half something that sounded an awful lot like the specific satisfaction of a person watching a trap close. "Mom," she said, "Bianca has been scheming for 4 years to steal a $380,000 beach cottage." She looked at me steadily. "She has no idea what's sitting on the cliff above her." "No," I said, "she does not." The call to Chief Thomas happened at 9:47 that same Sunday morning. Dale Thomas, 59 years old, 32 years with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department, currently serving his 3rd term as chief, picked up on the first ring the way he always did when he saw my name on the screen. Bill used to say that Dale Thomas answered the phone fast because he had spent his whole career being the person people called when something had gone badly wrong, and he had learned early that the first ring was the one that mattered most. Maggie. His voice was warm and immediately alert. "Everything okay?" "No," I said, "but it's going to be. I need your help, Dale." There was a short pause, the pause of a man recalibrating from a social call to something more serious. "Tell me what you need." I told him. All of it in the same order I had told Chloe, and Dale Thomas listened the way Bill had always said. He listened completely, without interrupting, without jumping to conclusions, without the impatient energy of someone waiting for their turn to speak. When I finished, there was a moment of quiet on the line, and then he said something that surprised me. "I've been waiting for something like this." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "Gavin Ross." Dale said, and the flatness in his voice when he said that name told me everything I needed to know about the history there. "I've had my eye on that man for 2 years. The license violations Chloe found, those are the tip of it, Maggie. There's a pattern of document fraud in 3 property transactions in this county over the past 18 months. I haven't had enough to move on him, until now." A pause. "If what Chloe has is what you say it is, this isn't just a civil matter. This is criminal fraud, forgery, conspiracy." My legs went so weak so suddenly that I had to sit down on the kitchen stool. Not from fear, from relief. The specific physical relief of a person who has been carrying something alone for too long and has just been told they don't have to carry it alone anymore. "Dale," I said, and my voice cracked straight down the middle. "Bill would—" "I know," he said, and his voice went rough at the edges, too. "I know he would. Let me help you finish this, Maggie, for both of you." I pressed my free hand over my eyes and breathed carefully until I trusted my voice again. "Thank you," I managed. "Don't thank me yet," he said, and I could hear him shifting into professional mode, the Dale Thomas, who had put away people who had done genuinely terrible things for 3 decades. "I'm going to need everything Chloe has, every document, every record, every piece of the chain. Can she get it to me by tomorrow morning?" Chloe, who had been listening from across the kitchen table without pretending not to, was already writing on her legal pad. She held it up so I could read it. "Tonight. I'll have it for him tonight." "Tonight," I told Dale. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Of course she will. Lord, that girl." A beat. "She's so much like Bill, it breaks my heart sometimes, Maggie. You know that." I did know that. I had known it every day for 22 years. After I ended the call, Chloe and I sat at the table and built what she called the architecture of the response, her phrase precise and deliberate, the kind of language that told me law school had given my daughter a vocabulary worthy of the mind she'd always had. The emergency injunction would be filed Monday morning based on the original documentation and evidence of fraudulent paperwork. Dale would begin the criminal investigation simultaneously, keeping it separate from the civil proceedings so neither track could contaminate the other. Chloe had already drafted the liability clause, the one that would separate Richard entirely from any financial penalties arising from the fraudulent transaction. "He needs to be protected," Chloe said firmly, tapping her pen on the pad. "Whatever happens to Bianca and the Ward family, Richard should not be financially destroyed by something he didn't understand he was agreeing to. He's still going to be devastated," I said quietly. The ache in my chest for my son was a constant thing now, a low throb underneath everything else. "Yes," Chloe said, "he is, but devastated and bankrupt are 2 different things, and we can fix one of them." She looked at me steadily. The other one he has to fix himself. I nodded slowly. She was right. She was almost always right, and it was one of the more humbling aspects of raising a child who turned out to be smarter than you. There was one more thing. The penalty clause, I said. Bianca signed it. Chloe pulled up something on her laptop and turned the screen to face me. There it was, Bianca's signature, neat and confident, on a contract that included a $50,000 penalty payable by the selling party in the event of failure to deliver clear title and vacant possession by the agreed date. She signed it 10 days ago, Chloe said. Didn't read past the headline numbers. She was too excited about the $380,000 to look at the fine print. I looked at that signature for a long moment. Bianca's handwriting, the looping, self-assured cursive of a woman who had been certain 10 days ago that she had already won. Your father used to say, I told Chloe that the most dangerous thing a person could do was stop paying attention the moment they thought they were ahead. Chloe smiled at me across the kitchen table. He was right about that, she said. He was right about most things. I agreed. He really was. I want to tell you what those 9 days felt like. Not nervous, not anxious, not the brittle, jangling tension of a person waiting for something bad to happen. Something steadier than that. Something closer to the feeling I used to get the night before a particularly important parent-teacher conference. The kind where you knew the conversation was going to be difficult, and you had prepared for every possible version of it, and all that remained was to walk into the room and let it unfold. Focused. That is the word. I felt focused the way the ocean looks focused right before it decides to take something back. Chloe returned to Boston on Monday morning with her laptop bag full of evidence and a list of filings that would have intimidated most practicing attorneys. She called me every evening at 7 o'clock, and those calls were the spine of my week 10 or 15 minutes of precise, efficient updates delivered in the calm, professional voice she used when she was managing something complex, followed always by 5 minutes of just talking. Mother and daughter the way we had talked since she was old enough to have opinions worth hearing. Injunction filed, she told me Monday evening. Judge Harrington's clerk confirmed receipt. We should have a ruling by Wednesday at the latest. And Dale, Chief Thomas has everything. He says the forgery evidence alone is enough for an arrest warrant. He's waiting until the closing to execute so we catch everyone in the same place at the same time. I breathed out slowly. Good. Mom. Her voice softened slightly. How are you doing actually? I looked out the kitchen window at the darkening water. I'm okay, I said. I keep thinking about Richard. I know, she said quietly. Me too. On Tuesday, Bianca called. I was in the garden when the phone rang, pulling the last of the season's rosemary, the kind of small domestic task that had always helped me think, and I looked at the screen and felt something tighten in my jaw before I made myself relax it deliberately. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Bianca. My voice came out warm and entirely normal. 30 years of teaching had given me extraordinary control over what my voice did in difficult moments. Margaret. She was using her businesslike tone today, clipped efficient, the voice of a woman who considered herself in charge of a transaction. I just wanted to confirm you've started the moving process. The buyers want a walkthrough on Friday and they'll need the property clear of personal items. Of course, I said pleasantly. I've been making arrangements. Good. A pause, and then something shifted in her voice, a hint of something sweeter, almost conciliatory, the way Bianca sometimes got when she wanted something she wasn't sure she was going to get. I know this is an adjustment, Margaret. Change is hard, but Richard and I really do think this is the best thing for everyone. The market up here is extraordinary right now, and frankly, a property like this is too much for one person to manage alone. Too much for one person to manage alone. My hand tightened around the bunch of rosemary until my knuckles ached. I breathed through my nose one long, slow breath, and I thought about Bill, about his hands on those receipts, about the concrete floor in the storage room, about the way he had looked, standing on the cliff above the lighthouse property with the wind in his hair, saying, "This one, Maggie, this is the one." "You're probably right," I said. "I'll be in touch about the arrangements." I ended the call and stood in the garden for a moment with the rosemary in my fist and my eyes burning furiously and my jaw clenched so tight it ached. Then I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth and took 3 long, careful breaths until the wave passed. She had called my husband's life's work too much for one person to manage. She had said it with sympathy in her voice. I went inside and called Chloe. "She called," I said when Chloe picked up. "I know. I saw it come through on the call log." There was a tight, controlled edge to Chloe's voice. "What did she say?" I told her. When I got to the part about too much for one person to manage, I heard a sharp exhale on the other end of the line, the sound of my daughter exercising the same restraint I had just exercised in the garden, with somewhat less composure. "She actually said that," Chloe said flatly. "With genuine sympathy," I confirmed. A pause. Then surprisingly, Chloe laughed short and hard and utterly without humor. "Mom," she said, "I have never looked forward to a Thursday morning more in my entire life." "Neither have I, baby," I said. "Neither have I." Wednesday brought the injunction. Ruling Judge Harrington granted it effective immediately, though the order would not be served until the moment of closing to avoid alerting the other parties. Dale called me himself to confirm his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man watching a case he had been building for 2 years finally reach its conclusion. "Everything is in position, Maggie," he said. "All you have to do is show up Thursday morning." "I'll be there," I said. "I know you will." A beat. Bill would want to be there too. My throat closed around something that hurt. "He will be," I said. "In every way that matters, Dale, he will be." Thursday came in cold water, the kind of morning that smells like salt and something final, the particular smell of the Maine coast in late October when the season is turned completely and the summer people are long gone and the coast belongs again to the people who have always belonged to it. I woke up at 5:30. I made tea. I sat on the back porch of the driftwood cottage one last time in the dark, and I looked at the water, and I talked to Bill the way I had learned to talk to him in the 5 years since he had been gone. Not out loud exactly, but not entirely in my head either. Something in between. Today's the day I told him. I've got the originals. I've got Chloe. I've got Dale. I've got everything you left me. The ocean moved in the dark below me, steady and unhurried the way it always had. Let's finish this. I arrived at the notary office on Congress Street in Portland at 8:42 in the morning. The closing was scheduled for 9 o'clock. I was 18 minutes early, which was intentional. In 30 years of teaching, I had learned that the person who arrives first controls the room not loudly, not aggressively, but in the quiet foundational way of someone who has already chosen their position before anyone else has walked through the door. The office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building 2 blocks from the waterfront, a clean professional space with cream-colored walls and a long conference table, and the particular hushed quality of a place where significant amounts of money regularly changed hands with very little ceremony. A receptionist offered me coffee. I asked for tea instead, and she brought it in a paper cup that was too hot to hold comfortably, which I held anyway because having something warm in my hands helped me stay still. I found a chair at the far end of the conference table near the window that looked out over the rooftops toward the water, and I sat down and I waited. The first person through the door after me was Gavin Ross. Gavin Ross, 35 years old, medium height, with the over-groomed appearance of a man who spent considerable time on his presentation and not enough on his character, came in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of practiced confidence that I suspected he put on every morning along with his cologne. He was the real estate agent who had listed the Driftwood Cottage using fraudulent documentation. Jasper Ward's gambling associate. The man whose fingerprints, metaphorically and perhaps literally, were on every piece of forged paperwork in this transaction. He glanced at me when he entered, gave me a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Mrs. Cross, good morning." "Good morning," I said pleasantly. He sat up at the head of the table and began laying out his documents with the organized efficiency of a man who had done this many times and expected today to go smoothly. I watched him from my end of the table and felt something cold and clear move through my chest. "Keep setting up Gavin. Jasper Ward arrived next with Cynthia 2 steps behind him. Jasper, 58, thick-shouldered with the permanently weathered face of a man who had spent decades on construction sites, walked in with his chest forward and his chin up, the posture of a man who believed he was about to collect something he was owed. He was wearing a sport coat that was slightly too small across the shoulders, and he had combed his gray hair in a way that suggested this was a special occasion. His eyes swept the room when he entered, and when they landed on me, something flickered across his face, a flash of something that might have been unease quickly covered by a broad smile. "Margaret," he said, opening his arms slightly as though we were old friends reuniting at a pleasant social occasion, rather than 2 people on opposite sides of a fraud. "Good to see you." "Jasper," I said. I smiled back. It cost me nothing. Cynthia, 55, dressed in an outfit that was aggressively expensive in a way that announced itself, moved past her husband and took a seat 2 chairs down from me without speaking directly to me, which suited us both. Then Richard walked in. My son. 32 years old, broad-shouldered like his father, with Bill's dark eyes and Bill's way of moving through a room. He was wearing a jacket I recognized gray wool, the one I had given him for his 30th birthday, and he looked tired in a way that went beyond one poor night's sleep. He looked tired in the way a person looks when they have been carrying something uncomfortable for a while without fully acknowledging what it is. His eyes found mine the moment he came through the door, and something moved through his face, complicated and quick, there and gone, before I could fully read it. Not guilt, exactly. More like the expression of a man who is simultaneously relieved and afraid to see his mother in this particular room. "Mom," he said. His voice came out rougher than I think he intended. "Richard." I kept my voice warm. I kept my face open. I would not make this harder for him than it was already going to be. He crossed to where I was sitting and bent down and hugged me briefly, stiffly, the hug of a man whose body is aware of something his mind hasn't finished processing yet, and I hugged him back fully, both arms the way I had hugged him since he was 9 years old, handing his father nails on a building site. "It's okay," I murmured against his shoulder. He pulled back and looked at my face, and his jaw tightened, and he nodded once sharply and went to sit on the other side of the table. Bianca arrived at 8:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled start. She came in the way she did everything, with full awareness of her own entrance, dressed sharply, carrying herself with the polished assurance of a woman who had rehearsed this moment many times and was confident in how it was going to end. She looked at Gavin. She looked at her parents. She looked at Richard. And then she looked at me sitting quietly at the far end of the table with my paper cup of tea and my handbag on the chair beside me, and she smiled. It was the smile of a person who thinks they have already won. "Margaret," she said in the warm, slightly patronizing tone she reserved for me, "I'm glad you came. This will all be very straightforward." "I'm sure it will be," I said. The notary, a composed woman in her 40s named Patricia Vance, who introduced herself briskly and arranged her documents with admirable efficiency, called the room to order at 9 o'clock precisely. And that was when the door opened for the second time. The door opened and attorney Susan Merrill walked in. Susan Merrill, 44 years old, a property and civil litigation attorney out of Brunswick, who had been practicing Maine real estate law for 18 years, was not a dramatic woman. She was precise, economical, and had the particular energy of someone who had seen enough courtrooms to be entirely unbothered by the temperature of any given room. She was carrying a slim leather briefcase and a manila envelope, and she walked to the empty chair beside me and sat down without any preamble whatsoever. Bianca's eyes tracked her across the room. Something shifted behind them, the first hairline crack in that polished composure. "Who is this?" she said, looking at me. "This is my attorney," I said pleasantly. "Susan Merrill. She's here to assist with the closing." Bianca's jaw tightened. She looked at Gavin Ross. Gavin Ross looked back at her with an expression that was working very hard to stay neutral and not quite managing it. Patricia Vance, the notary, cleared her throat. "Shall we proceed?" "Please," said Susan and opened her briefcase. What happened in the next 4 minutes I want to describe carefully because I have replayed it many times since, and I want to get it exactly right. Susan removed 2 documents from her briefcase and placed them side by side in the center of the table. The first was a thick sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip. The second was a single sheet with an official court seal at the top. "Before this closing proceeds," Susan said in the measured, unhurried tone of someone reading a weather report, "I need to draw everyone's attention to 2 items. The first is an emergency injunction granted yesterday afternoon by Judge Harrington of the Cumberland County Superior Court, effective immediately, which freezes all transactions related to the property at 614 Shoreline Road, Harpswell, pending resolution of a disputed title claim." The room went absolutely electric. Gavin Ross's hand stopped moving over his documents. Jasper Ward made a sound, a short, strangled sound somewhere between a cough and something worse, and grabbed the edge of the table with both hands. Cynthia Ward's face went the color of old chalk. Richard sat very still, his eyes moving rapidly between Susan and me, trying to catch up with what was happening. And Bianca's face did something I had not seen it do in the 3 years I had known her. It cracked. Not completely, not yet, but the surface of that practiced composure fractured in a way that showed just briefly what was underneath. Her lips parted. Her eyes went wide and then immediately narrow. A muscle jumped in her jaw. "What is this?" she said. Her voice came out sharp and too loud. "What is this, Margaret?" "Let Susan finish," I said quietly. "The second item," Susan continued as though Bianca had not spoken, "is the original property deed for 614 Shoreline Road, along with 30 years of continuous maintenance and ownership documentation in the name of William and Margaret Cross, authenticated and notarized." She laid the manila envelope on the table and opened it, spreading the contents in a neat line. The co-ownership amendment adding Richard Cross's name was filed in good faith. However, the listing agreement and purchase contract were executed using fraudulent documentation that misrepresented Richard Cross's authority to act unilaterally. Under Maine property law, a co-owned property requires written consent from all owners for any transfer of title. That consent was never obtained from Margaret Cross. Susan folded her hands on the table. "This closing cannot proceed." Garrison Albright, who had been sitting across the table with his wife Evelyn, both of them very still in the way that wealthy people get still when legal problems enter a room, leaned toward his own attorney and murmured something. His attorney murmured back. Garrison Albright looked at Gavin Ross with the cold, flat expression of a man recalculating a significant financial decision in real time. "We're done here," Garrison said. He said it quietly to no one in particular and began gathering his documents. "Mr. Albright," Gavin Ross started. "We are done," Garrison repeated, and the finality in his voice closed that conversation completely. Evelyn Albright was already standing, already reaching for her coat, already mentally removing herself from a transaction that had just become someone else's catastrophic problem. That was when the door opened a third time. Chief Dale Thomas stepped into the room. 59 years old, 32 years in law enforcement, built like a man who had never stopped taking the job seriously. He was in uniform, and he had 2 deputies with him, and the moment he walked through that door, the entire atmosphere of the room changed in a way that was physical. You could feel it a shift in pressure, like the moment before a storm breaks. His eyes went to Gavin Ross first, then to Jasper Ward. "Mr. Ross," Dale said in a voice that carried 32 years of authority. "Mr. Ward, I need you both to come with me, please." Jasper Ward shoved back from the table so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "Now wait just a— Mr. Ward." Dale's voice did not change in volume or temperature by a single degree. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Jasper's face had gone deep red, the furious, cornered red of a man who had gambled on the wrong hand and couldn't believe the cards had turned. His mouth worked for a moment without producing words. Then one of the deputies stepped forward, and Jasper Ward's bluster collapsed all at once. His shoulders dropped. His chin came down, and what was left was just a tired, frightened older man who had helped his daughter do something unforgivable. Gavin Ross went quietly. He didn't say a word. He picked up his leather portfolio. I don't know why there was nothing useful in it anymore. And he walked to the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this for a long time, and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. Bianca stood up. Her hands were pressed flat on the table and her knuckles had gone white, and her voice, when she finally found it, was shaking in a way I had never heard from her before. "You planned this," she said. She was looking straight at me. "This whole time, you planned all of this." I looked at my daughter-in-law across the conference table. I thought about Bill, about his hands and his receipts and the safe he had bolted to the concrete floor because he believed that a person's important things deserved something solid underneath them. "I'm a teacher, Bianca," I said. "Planning lessons is what I do." Dale Thomas touched Bianca's arm. "Ma'am," he said, "you'll need to come with us as well." Bianca's eyes filled furious tears, hot and indignant, and she looked at Richard one last time with an expression I could not fully interpret. Richard looked back at his wife, and what was on his face was not anger, and was not grief, and was not even surprise. It was something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. It was the look of a man who has finally completely understood something he had been refusing to see. The room emptied in 11 minutes. And then it was just us. The conference room felt different with only 4 of us in it. Smaller somehow, more honest. The way a stage feels after the performance is over and the lights come up and all that's left is the actual wood and actual dust and the people who were always going to be there when everything else cleared away. Maggie, Chloe, Richard, and the particular quality of silence that follows something enormous. Richard was still in his chair. He had not moved since the deputies had escorted Bianca through the door. His elbows were on the table, and his face was in his hands, and his shoulders were doing something that I recognized with a sharp maternal ache, the specific trembling of a grown man trying very hard not to fall apart completely in front of his mother. Chloe sat 2 chairs down from him. She had her laptop open and her legal pad in front of her, but she was not looking at either of them. She was looking at her brother with an expression that was equal parts love and grief, and the complicated fury of a younger sister who had seen this coming and had not been able to stop it. I sat at the head of the table, the chair Patricia Vance had occupied an hour ago, and I looked at my son, and I felt everything a mother feels when her child is in pain, and she is the one who, however, necessarily helped bring that pain into the room. "Richard," I said gently. He lifted his face from his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed and wet at the corners, and there was a rawness to his expression that I hadn't seen since the morning we buried his father. He looked at me the way he had looked at me when he was 9 years old and had broken the kitchen window with a baseball and couldn't figure out whether to confess or run that particular combination of shame and desperate hope that children carry and adults sometimes forget how to put down. "Mom," he said. His voice came out broken in the middle. "I need you to know, I need you to understand that I didn't." "I know," I said. "Richard, I know." He pressed his lips together hard and nodded, and 2 tears ran straight down his face that he didn't bother wiping away. "She told me the paperwork was for the baby's college fund," he said. "She had there were folders. Mom, there were 40 pages of documents, and she walked me through this summary sheet that said it was about investment accounts. And He stopped, pressed his hand over his mouth, breathed. "I signed it because I trusted her, because she was my wife, and I trusted her completely." The pain in my chest at that was something I had no adequate word for. Not anger at Richard. Nothing close to anger, just the deep, specific grief of watching someone you love realize they have been used by a person who should have protected them. "I know you did," I said, "and we're going to talk about all of that. But first, I need you to hear something." I nodded at Chloe. Chloe reached into her bag and removed her phone. She placed it on the table between us, screen up. She looked at Richard steadily, and something passed between them, that particular sibling communication that happens without words, something between a warning and an apology. "Richard," Chloe said carefully, "I need you to listen to this, all the way through. Can you do that?" Richard straightened in his chair. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "Play it," he said. Chloe pressed play. Bianca's voice filled the room, clear and sharp and completely unguarded, the voice of a woman, speaking to her parents in the privacy of what she believed was an entirely secure conversation. The recording had been made 6 weeks earlier, captured through a method Chloe declined to fully explain to me on the grounds that I was better off not knowing the specific details. "It's basically done," Bianca said on the recording, her voice bright with the particular excitement of someone who has been working towards something for a long time and can finally see the finish line. "Richard signed everything. He thinks it's for the baby. He has absolutely no idea." Jasper's voice rougher, more cautious. "And the old woman, Margaret," a dismissive sound. "She's a retired school teacher living alone in a beach house. She doesn't have the resources or the legal knowledge to fight this. By the time she understands what's happened, the closing will be done, and the money will already be in your account, Mom." Cynthia Ward's voice satisfied. "How much exactly after Ross's cut and the penalty we're fronting?" Dad a pause. The sound of calculation, about $240,000, split between the three of us. "What about Richard?" Jasper asked. A short laugh from Bianca. The kind of laugh that had nothing warm in it at all. "Richard gets to keep believing he did something good for his family. That's all he needs. Honestly, Dad, he is the most manageable person I have ever met in my life. I point him in a direction and he walks. That's it. That's the whole thing." I watched my son's face as he listened to his wife describe him. I watched the color drain out of it slowly, completely, the way color drains from something that has been exposed to a cold it wasn't built for. His jaw went rigid. His hands flat on the table began to shake, a fine, involuntary trembling that he couldn't control and didn't try to. His eyes stayed fixed on the phone with the expression of a man staring at something he cannot look away from and cannot bear to keep looking at. When the recording ended, the room was very quiet. Richard's hands were still shaking. He looked at the phone for a long moment. Then he looked up at me, and his face crumpled completely, not slowly, not with any of the control he had been trying to maintain, but all at once the way a structure fails when the load finally exceeds what it was built to carry. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the single syllable so completely that it barely made a sound at all. I was out of my chair and around the table before he finished saying it. I put both arms around my son and held him the way I had held him when he was 9 years old and the world had been too big and too confusing, and he bent his head down to my shoulder and sobbed deep, wrenching sobs that shook his whole body, the kind that come from somewhere below grief, from the place where trust used to live before something tore it out by the roots. "I've got you," I said into his hair. "I've got you, Richard. I've got you." Chloe reached across the table and put her hand on her brother's arm and held it there, and the three of us stayed like that for a long moment, broken and whole, at the same time the way families sometimes are. Bianca was brought back into the conference room at 10:47. Dale had kept her in a separate office down the hallway while the initial paperwork was processed, standard procedure he had told me for a situation involving multiple parties and overlapping charges. When she came back through the door, one of the deputies a step behind her, she looked different than she had when she left. Not smaller, exactly, but something in the architecture of her confidence had shifted. The polish was still there, the clothes, the posture, the careful arrangement of her face into an expression of controlled indignation. But underneath it, visible now in the set of her jaw and the slight over-brightness of her eyes, was something that all that polish had previously managed to hide. She was frightened. Good, I thought, and was not ashamed of thinking it. Richard had composed himself by the time she came back. He was sitting up straight, his face rinsed of expression, his hands folded on the table in front of him. When Bianca entered, he looked at her. Really looked at her the way you look at something you are seeing clearly for the first time, and then he looked away. Not in hurt, not in anger. With the deliberate final quality of a man closing a door. Bianca saw it. I watched her see it, watch something flash across her face. Pain, genuine pain. The first genuine thing I had seen from her in 3 years, and then she straightened her spine and looked at me instead. "I want to speak with my own attorney," she said. "You're welcome to," I said, "but I'd like to say a few things first if you'll allow me." I paused. "You don't have to listen, but I think you should." Something moved through her expression calculation, mostly the reflex of a person assessing every angle. Then she pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. She crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her chin in a way that was meant to look like defiance and looked to my eye like a young woman trying very hard to appear less afraid than she was. "Go ahead," she said. I took a breath. I thought about what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it the way I had always thought before the difficult conversations, the ones that mattered, the ones where the words had weight, and the person on the other side of them needed to actually receive them rather than deflect them. "I'm not going to talk about the legal consequences," I said. "Susan and Dale have covered that, and you'll hear more from your own attorney. What I want to talk about is simpler than that." Bianca's eyes were wary. She said nothing, but her chin came down a fraction. "You came into this family 4 years ago with a plan," I said. "A detailed, patient, carefully constructed plan. And I want to acknowledge that because I think it deserves to be acknowledged. You are not stupid, Bianca. You are genuinely intelligent. You have a real talent for reading people and for understanding how systems work and how to move through them." I paused. "I want you to hear me say that clearly because what I'm going to say next is not about your intelligence. It's about what you chose to do with it." Her jaw tightened. "Margaret, you chose Richard," I said, "not because you loved him, but because he was the most accessible route to something you wanted. You chose him because he was good, genuinely constitutionally good, and you understood that goodness was something you could use." I kept my voice even, not cold. Not warm, simply true. You used his trust and his love for his child and his desire to be a good husband as the instruments of his own destruction. And I want you to understand something about that. Bianca's arms were still crossed, but her knuckles had gone white. A muscle in her jaw flickered. "That goodness you used," I said quietly. "That generosity, that trust, that willingness to believe the best of the person he loved that came from his father. Bill Cross spent 31 years teaching other people's children how to be decent human beings, and he raised a son who carried that decency into every room he ever walked into. You took the finest thing about Richard and you turned it into a weapon against him." The over-brightness in Bianca's eyes intensified. She blinked fast and deliberate, but not fast enough. 2 tears broke and ran down her face before she could stop them, and I watched her jaw work as she fought to get herself back under control. "And here is what I most want you to understand," I said, "not as a threat, as the truth. You spent 4 years on this, 4 years of planning and maneuvering and constructing and executing. You were patient and you were clever and you were thorough. I leaned forward slightly, and you lost. Not because you made a mistake in the plan. You lost because 30 years ago, a man who trusted people and believed in doing things right and kept every single original document he ever signed had already built something stronger than anything you could construct in 4 years. You didn't lose to me, Bianca." I held her eyes. "You lost to Bill." The sound Bianca made then was not a sob and was not a word. It was something that came from somewhere deeper than either of those things, a broken, involuntary sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised the rest of us. She pressed the back of her hand hard against her mouth, and her shoulders shook once, and then she pulled herself back together with a visible physical effort that I found myself unexpectedly respecting. She was many things. She was not weak. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was steadier than I expected. "Now," I said, "you speak with your attorney, and then I imagine you have a very difficult conversation with your parents who are currently in considerably more legal trouble than you may have anticipated when you brought them into this." I paused. Chloe has filed paperwork that separates Richard entirely from the financial and legal consequences of this transaction. He will not be held responsible for what you signed in his name. That was my condition for not pursuing additional civil damages. Bianca looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through her face that I couldn't fully name, not gratitude, not quite, but something in that territory. Something that recognized what had just been given. "Why?" she asked. I looked at her steadily. "Because he is my son," I said, "and because whatever you think of me, Bianca, I am not the kind of person who punishes a child for the sins of the people who were supposed to love them." She flinched. It was small and quick, but it was real. The deputy stepped forward. "Ms. Ward," he said quietly. Bianca stood. She straightened her jacket. She picked up her bag. She looked at Richard one last time, and Richard looked back at her this time fully, without looking away. And what was on his face was the saddest thing I had seen in that room all morning. Not hatred, not even anger, just the enormous, irrevocable loss of something he had believed in completely. "I'm sorry, Richard," Bianca said. Her voice cracked on his name. Richard looked at his wife for one long, final moment. Then he said very quietly, "I know you are." The deputy opened the door and Bianca Ward walked out of the room and out of our family. Ceci. We stayed like that for a while, the three of us tangled and quiet and slowly putting ourselves back together. Then Richard sat up. He wiped his face with both hands, a thorough, deliberate gesture, the gesture of a man deciding to move forward. He looked at the folder I had placed on the table before the closing began. He looked at me. "You said you had something to tell us," he said. His voice was steadier than I expected. "Before everything you said, there was something else." "Yes," I said. "There is. Not at the door exactly, but at the air in front of it, the way a person stares at the place where something was after it is gone." His face had the hollowed-out quality of someone who has just set down a weight they had been carrying for so long, they had forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. Empty and exhausted, and underneath both of those things, something tentative and fragile that I recognized as the very earliest beginning of relief. Chloe was watching her brother with the careful attention of someone ready to respond to whatever happened next. She had her hand flat on the table between them, not touching him, but close enough that he could reach it if he needed to. I gave them both 30 seconds. Then I said, "Richard, I need to tell you something." He turned to look at me. His eyes were still red, still raw, but steadier now than they had been. "Mom," he said, "before you say anything, I need to say I'm sorry. I need you to hear that first." His voice was rough, but controlled. "I know what I did. Adding my name to the deed, signing those papers, I know that gave her the opening. I know that if I hadn't been so—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, breathed. "If I hadn't been so willing to just go along, none of this would have been possible." "Richard, please." He held up one hand. "Let me finish." He looked down at the table, then back up at me. Dad trusted people. He trusted people completely and openly and without reservation, and I always thought I got that from him and that it was a good thing, something to be proud of. His jaw tightened. "I'm not sure I know what to think about it anymore." The ache in my chest at that was profound and specific. I leaned forward and put both hands over his on the table and held them. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. "Your father's trust was not a weakness. It was never a weakness. The fact that someone found a way to exploit it does not make it a flaw, it makes them a predator. Those are not the same thing, and I will not sit here and watch you turn one of the finest things about yourself into something to be ashamed of." I squeezed his hands hard. "Do you understand me?" Richard looked at me for a long moment. His eyes filled again, and this time he didn't fight it. He let 2 tears fall and blinked the rest back and nodded once, with the slow certainty of a man accepting something he needed to hear. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, Mom, I understand." I held his hands for another moment. Then I sat back and I reached into my handbag and I removed a folder I had placed there 3 days ago and had not opened since. I put it on the table in the center of the 3 of us. "I have something to tell you both," I said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago. I didn't for reasons that made sense to me at the time and that I'm going to explain now." I opened the folder. 3 years ago, your father and I found a property, a house on a cliff above the ocean 40 minutes north of here, on a promontory with a decommissioned lighthouse tower and a view of the Atlantic that will change the way you think about the word beautiful. Richard frowned slightly, the small, confused frown of a person trying to reorient. "What property I didn't know about any—" "Nobody did," I said. That was intentional. I found the appraisal document in the folder and placed it face down on the table between us. "Your father found it on a Sunday drive the September before he got his diagnosis. We bought it 3 months later after we understood what the diagnosis meant. Bill insisted. He said—" My voice caught briefly and I cleared it. "He said he needed to know I had somewhere higher to stand when he was gone." Chloe made a sound soft and involuntary, her hand going to her mouth for just a moment before she lowered it. Her eyes were very bright. "We used the someday account," I said. "Everything we had saved across 30 years, plus Bill's life insurance policy, $680,000. I paused. "I put it in a trust, the Lighthouse Conservation Trust, with Chloe listed as the legal representative, which meant the property had no public connection to my name, which meant that when Bianca spent 4 years researching the Cross family's assets, I looked at Richard. She never found it, not once." Richard was staring at me. His mouth had opened slightly. "Mom," he said, "are you telling me—" "I'm getting there," I said gently. "The property is called the Clipper Lighthouse. Stone foundation, cedar shingles, wraparound porch, decommissioned lighthouse tower on the east corner. The last time Bill saw it was on a screen in a hospital room when I showed him the photographs after we signed the purchase agreement. He held my hand and he said—" I stopped, took a breath, let it out slowly. He said, "Good. That's good, Maggie." The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling, the distant sound of traffic on Congress Street below. "Last month," I said, "I had the property appraised. Routine trust administration." I turned over the document in the center of the table so both of them could read it. This is what came back. Richard leaned forward. He read the number. I watched his face. I have taught for 30 years. I have watched thousands of moments of comprehension move across thousands of faces, the moment when something complex becomes clear, when a student moves from confusion to understanding. I know what that looks like from every angle and in every variety. What moved across Richard's face was not just comprehension. It was the specific, staggering comprehension of a person who has just understood simultaneously what they almost lost and what they never knew they had. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of about 4 seconds. The first was simple shock eyes, wide jaw, dropping slightly, the involuntary physical response to a number larger than expected. The second was calculation. I could see him doing the math, comparing the figure on the page to the $380,000 Bianca had been so certain she was stealing. The third was something I can only describe as devastation of a particular kind, the kind that comes not from losing something, but from understanding the full scale of what you were almost made to destroy. $1.2 million, he said. The words came out barely above a whisper. 1.2 million, I confirmed. Richard pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to us, one hand braced against the frame, looking out over the Portland rooftops toward the line of gray water visible in the distance. His shoulders were shaking. "Richard," Chloe said softly. "Give me a second," he said. His voice was muffled tight. the voice of a man fighting very hard for composure and not entirely winning. "Just give me a second." We gave him his second, and another, and several more after that. When he finally turned around, his face was wet, and his eyes were red, and he looked, I thought, more like his father than he had in years, that particular combination of emotional openness and stubborn dignity that Bill had carried his entire life. "She was going to sell a $380,000 beach house," he said. "And Dad left you." He stopped, shook his head. "Dad left us a $1.2 million cliff house that she didn't even know existed." "Your father built things to last," I said. "That's all he ever did. Everything he touched, he built to last." Richard crossed back to the table. He sat down. He looked at the appraisal document for a long moment, and then he looked at me, and then he said something that I had not expected and that undid me more completely than anything else that had happened in that room all morning. "Can I see it?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "The Clipper Lighthouse. Can we go see it?" The three of us. My throat closed around something too large and too full to name. I pressed my lips together and nodded, and my eyes spilled over, and I didn't do anything about the tears running down my face because some moments don't require composure. "Yes," I said. "I think your father would have liked that very much." "Because I wasn't sure what you would do," I said. "Not because I don't trust you, I want to be clear about that, but because I know you, Richard. I know that if I had called you and said Bianca is fraudulently selling your father's house, your first instinct would have been to confront her directly. And the moment she knew we were aware of what she was doing, she would have changed the plan, covered her tracks, made it much harder to prove. And Gavin Ross and your father-in-law would have walked away clean." Richard was quiet for a moment. "You needed them all in the same room," he said. "I needed them all in the same room." I confirmed. He turned to look at me. "That's Mom, that's pretty cold." "Yes," I said, "it is." He held my gaze for a moment. Then something broke open in his expression. Not anger, not quite, but something related to it. Something that had been compressed under everything else and was finally finding room to move. "She used me," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "She looked me in the face every single day for 3 years, and she used me. She used Dad's house. He stopped, turned back to the window, pressed the heel of his hand against his eye. "I keep thinking about the baby, our son. She was going to use our son as the reason I signed those papers, and his voice broke completely. He pressed both hands over his face and made a sound that was raw and muffled and came from somewhere a long way down, and I reached over and put my hand on his arm and held it there while he worked through it. The particular kind of crying that is also a kind of anger, the grief of betrayal, which is different from ordinary grief because it has nowhere clean to go. "I know," I said. "I know, sweetheart. He deserves better than that," Richard said from behind his hands. "My son deserves better than that for a mother." "He has you," I said firmly. "He has you, and he has me, and he has Chloe. He is going to be so loved, Richard. I promise you that." Richard lowered his hands. His face was wet and his eyes were swollen, and he looked in that moment exhausted in the bone-deep way of someone who has been braced for impact for a long time and has finally been allowed to stop bracing. He looked out the windshield at the coast road unspooling ahead of us, the pine trees thick on both sides, the occasional glimpse of gray water through the gaps. "Tell me about the house," he said. "Tell me what it's like." So I told him. I told him about the Sunday drive, about the unpaved road through the old-growth pines, about the granite promontory and the lighthouse tower, and the way the view from that cliff stopped the breath clean in your chest. I told him about standing there with his father, about the wind and the gray October sky, and Bill turning to me with those certain eyes and saying this, "One Maggie." He said that. Richard's voice was soft. "Just like that," I said. No hesitation. He knew immediately. "That was so Dad," Richard said, and laughed a short, wet, surprised laugh, the kind that comes when grief and love arrive at the same moment. He always just knew about everything. Remember when he picked out the kayaks, spent about 45 seconds in the shop and said those two, that's it, and walked to the register. "And he was right about both of them," I said. "He was always right," Richard said. He was smiling now, a real smile, tentative and hurting around the edges, but genuine all the way through. Annoyingly, consistently right. He was, I agreed. It was one of his less endearing qualities. Richard laughed again, fuller this time, and the sound of it filled the car, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been pulled tight since 8:14 on Monday morning. Something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was in the neighborhood of both. We turned off the main road onto the unpaved track through the pines. The trees closed in, overhead blocking the pale autumn sky, and the quality of light changed dimmer, greener the particular hush of old-growth forest. Richard sat forward slightly in his seat. "This is it," he said. "Keep watching," I said. The trees opened and the promontory appeared, and the Clipper Lighthouse came into view. Richard made a sound. Not a word, just a sound low and involuntary, the sound a person makes when something exceeds what they had prepared themselves for. He put his hand on the dashboard and leaned forward as I pulled the car to a stop, and he looked at the house the way his father had looked at it 8 years ago, with complete attention, with recognition, with the expression of someone seeing something they have been looking for without knowing they were looking. The stone foundation, the silver-weathered cedar shingles, the wraparound porch catching the afternoon light, the lighthouse tower rising from the east corner, white against the gray sky, solid and extraordinary. "Oh," Richard said quietly. "Oh, Mom." I parked and we got out. Chloe pulled up behind us a moment later and climbed out of Richard's car and came to stand beside us, the three of us in a line on the granite shelf above the Atlantic, the wind coming off the water, cold and salt-sharp and relentless. Below us, 200 feet down the ocean, moved vast and gray and indifferent and magnificent, the kind of view that makes human problems feel simultaneously smaller and more precious because it reminds you that you are brief and that everything you love is brief, and that this is not a reason for despair, but the most urgent possible reason to protect the things worth protecting. Richard walked to the edge of the promontory and stood there for a long moment, with his hands in his pockets and the wind moving his hair, and I watched him, and my heart was so full it was almost painful, because he looked so much like his father standing there that for one terrible and wonderful second I could almost believe Bill was still in the world somewhere, still standing on some cliff or another, still looking at the ocean with those certain unhurried eyes. "He stood right here," Richard said. It wasn't a question. "Right there," I said. 8 years ago." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around, and his eyes were wet again, but his face was steady, and he said, "I want to be better, Mom. I want to be the kind of man he was. I know I've been—" He stopped, searched for the word. "I know I've been going along with things, not just with Bianca, for years. Just going along because it was easier than standing still and deciding for myself what I actually believed." He looked at me with an openness that I recognized it was the same openness Bill had carried, the willingness to be seen clearly that some people spend their whole lives running from. "I want to stop going along," he said. "I want to start building." My throat tightened so completely that for a moment I couldn't speak at all. I crossed the granite shelf, and I took my son's face in both my hands, the way I had when he was small, and I looked at him directly, and I said, "Then build, that's all, just build." He covered my hands with his and held them there, and his eyes spilled over, and mine did too. And we stood on the cliff his father had found on a Sunday afternoon 8 years ago, and we let ourselves cry without apology, the way people cry when they have earned it. Behind us, Chloe made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. "Okay," she said, her voice thick. "Okay, I'm crying too, just so everyone knows this is a group situation. Richard laughed, a real, full, chest-deep laugh that startled a pair of seabirds off the rocks below us. And Chloe laughed, and I laughed. And for a moment, the three of us stood on that cliff above the Atlantic and laughed and cried. At the same time, the way families do, when something has broken and the breaking has revealed underneath something stronger than what was there before. The lighthouse tower cast a long shadow across the granite shelf. The ocean moved below us, steady and enormous, completely unbothered. Good, I thought to Bill, to the wind, to whatever of him was still in the world. We're okay. We're gonna be okay. 3 days after the closing table collapsed, I was sitting at my kitchen counter with a mug of chamomile tea when my phone buzzed. It was Dale Thomas. "Maggie," he said, and I could hear the particular satisfaction in his voice, the kind a man carries when years of careful work finally produce a clean result. "I thought you'd want to know. Gavin Ross accepted a plea deal this morning. Document forgery wire fraud. He'll serve 18 months and surrender his real estate license permanently." I set my mug down slowly. "And Jasper Ward is looking at 32 months. His attorney tried to negotiate, but the judge wasn't in a generous mood." Dale paused. "Turns out Gavin wasn't the only contractor Jasper had defrauded. There were 2 other families, Maggie. Other people's homes, other people's signatures." My throat tightened. I pressed my hand flat against the counter, steadying myself. All those months I had spent afraid that I was being dramatic, afraid that I was imagining the worst of people, and it turned out the worst had been real all along. It had been sitting right there at my Sunday dinners, complimenting my pot roast. "What about Cynthia?" I asked. "Cynthia Ward cooperated with investigators," Dale said. "In exchange for testimony against Jasper and Gavin, she received a suspended sentence and 3 years of probation. She'll pay back the escrow funds, every cent that was moved into her account." I exhaled slowly. "How much?" $47,000 plus interest. I didn't feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. What I felt was something quieter and heavier, the exhaustion of a person who has carried a weight for so long that when it finally lifts, the absence of it feels strange, almost disorienting. "And Bianca?" I asked. There was a brief pause on Dale's end. Her attorney contacted the court yesterday. She's not fighting the penalty clause. The $50,000 will be paid in full within 90 days per the contract she signed. I almost laughed, because there was something deeply, painfully ironic about the fact that Bianca, who had spent 4 years engineering every detail, every document, every carefully timed conversation, had signed her own financial reckoning with a confident pen stroke, never once stopping to read what was directly in front of her. "Dale," I said, "thank you for everything." "Bill was my friend for 30 years, he said simply. "This is the least I could do." After I hung up, I stayed at the counter for a long time. The morning light was coming through the window at that particular October angle that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting, golden, and a little melancholy the way Maine always is in the fall. I thought about Bianca Ward. I want to be clear, I did not hate her. I had tried very hard not to hate her, and I think I had mostly succeeded. What I felt instead was something closer to grief, the grief of a woman who had watched another woman choose the worst version of herself and then follow that choice all the way to its conclusion. She had been smart. She had been capable. She had spotted a vulnerability, a widow, an aging beachfront property, a son who trusted too easily, and she had moved on it with precision. In another life, with those same qualities, pointed in a different direction, she might have built something real, something lasting. Instead, she had built a case file. 2 weeks later, Chloe called me from Boston. "Mom," she said, and I could hear the particular brightness in her voice that she gets when she has good news and is trying to sound casual about it. "I got a call from Professor Alderman this morning, the one who runs the property law clinic. He read the injunction filing. He wants to use it as a teaching case." She paused. He said it was, and I'm quoting directly here, one of the cleanest emergency applications he had seen from a non-barred practitioner in 20 years. I pressed my hand to my mouth, my eyes burned, and I let them. "Chloe," I managed. "Don't cry, Mom. You'll make me cry." "I'm not crying," I said, which was an absolute lie, and she knew it, and she started laughing, and I started laughing too, even though tears were running down my face and my voice had gone wobbly and undignified. "Dad would have thought that was funny," she said softly. "He would have printed it out and put it on the refrigerator," I said. We both went quiet for a moment, not the strained quiet of grief, but the warm, familiar quiet of people who share the same memories and don't always need words for them. "How's Richard?" she asked. "He called on Sunday," I said. "Both Sundays since Portland." "That's good. He sounds like himself again, or maybe a better version of himself, a more careful version." I looked out the window at the October sea. "He asked about the lighthouse, whether he might be allowed to visit for Thanksgiving." Chloe's voice softened. "What did you say?" I said yes, I told her. I said of course. I said bring a warm coat. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in November, 43 days after the closing table fell apart. Richard signed the papers alone without a lawyer present on his side. He had wanted it that way, he told me afterward. He wanted to look Bianca in the eye one last time and say something true. He told me what he said. I won't repeat it here because it belonged to him. Those words were his, alone earned through his own particular humiliation and his own slow, difficult climb back toward himself. What I will say is, this Richard Cross came out of that Wednesday with straighter shoulders than the ones he had walked in with. That mattered. The trust was restructured the following week. Chloe handled the paperwork. The Lighthouse Conservation Trust was amended to include Richard as a secondary beneficiary, not with access, not with control, but with inclusion. Because he was still my son. Because Bill had loved him. Because whatever Bianca had done, Richard's name still belonged in the family's story. Bianca's name did not appear anywhere in the new documents. Not once. On the last Friday of November, I drove alone to the Clipper Lighthouse. It was early evening and the sky was doing something extraordinary, that deep bruised purple that Maine skies produce in late autumn, just before dark, shot through with pale gold along the horizon line. I parked at the top of the gravel path and walked down to the granite shelf where the cedar-sided house sat, with its back to the wind and its face to the Atlantic. The air smelled of salt and cold and something faintly pine-scented blowing in from the north. I stood at the cliff's edge for a long time. I thought about all the things that had happened in 6 months. The phone call on a Monday morning, the manila envelope in Bill's safe, the 3 empty coffee mugs on Chloe's legal pad at 6 in the morning, the moment in the conference room when Patricia Vance had looked up from her folder and the whole architecture of Bianca's scheme had begun quietly and irrevocably to fall. And I thought about what I wanted to carry forward from all of it. Not the anger. I had held that for a while, and it had served its purpose, and now I was ready to put it down. Not the fear. That, too, had served its purpose. The fear had made me careful, and careful had made me effective. What I wanted to carry forward was something simpler, something Bill had always known and had spent 30 years trying to teach me by example. The things worth protecting are never the things you can appraise. The Driftwood cottage was worth $380,000 to Garrison and Evelyn Albright. To me, it was worth the summer of 1993 when Bill and I painted the porch railings, while Richard, 4 years old, sat on the steps and solemnly handed us brushes, one at a time. It was worth every Thanksgiving, every 4th of July, every foggy October morning with 2 mugs of coffee on the railing and nothing that needed to be said. The Clipper Lighthouse was worth $1.2 million to an appraiser's spreadsheet. To me, it was worth the Sunday afternoon. Bill pointed at it from a kayak and said this one, Maggie, with the certainty of a man who understood that some things are worth more than their asking price. No document forgery could touch those things. No penalty clause, no closing table. They were ours. They had always been ours. The wind picked up off the water, and I pulled my coat tighter and looked out at the darkening ocean, and for the first time in 6 months, maybe longer, I felt something I recognized as peace. "Not yet, Bill," I said quietly to the water. "I'll be along." But not yet. I hadn't asked him to. He hadn't announced it. Somewhere between the drive back from the lighthouse and the moment Chloe reheated the leftover sweet potato casserole on the stovetop, it simply became understood the way certain things become understood in families that have been through something together without anyone needing to say them out loud. By 7 o'clock, the three of us were in the living room. Chloe had claimed the armchair closest to the window with her feet tucked under her and a mug of tea balanced on the armrest. Richard sat on the far end of the couch with his elbows on his knees, turning his coffee mug slowly in both hands, the way Bill used to turn things when he was thinking a habit so specific and so unconscious that the first time I noticed Richard doing it years ago, I had to leave the room for a moment. The fire was going. Outside, the November wind was doing serious work against the windows, and the cottage made the sounds old houses make in cold weather, the particular creaking of wood that has expanded and contracted through 30 Maine winters and knows by now exactly how to settle. It was Chloe who broke the quiet first. "Can I ask you something, Mom?" She was looking at me over the rim of her mug. "Something I've been thinking about since Portland." "Of course," I said. "When you bought the Clipper Lighthouse," she said carefully. "Did Dad know at the end, I mean? Did he understand what it was going to mean for you after?" I looked at the fire for a moment. The question deserved a real answer, not a quick one. "He knew exactly what it meant," I said. "That was the point of it. Bill was a man who planned things. Not because he was afraid of the future, because he loved the people in it." I set my own mug down on the side table. He sat across from me at that kitchen table the week after the diagnosis, and he said, "Maggie, I need to know you have somewhere that's yours, not ours. Yours. Something no one can reach." I paused. He already knew by then. He knew what grief does to people. He knew what it does to families. He wanted to build something that would hold after he was gone. The room was very quiet. The fire shifted and settled. Richard looked up from his coffee mug. His eyes were red at the edges. Not fresh tears, but the residual rawness of a man who had done significant crying earlier in the day and had not quite finished processing the aftermath. "He did that," he said quietly. "He actually did that." "He did," I said. Richard set his mug on the coffee table and leaned back against the couch cushions and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "I keep thinking," he said, "about all the Sunday dinners, all the times Bianca sat at this table and asked questions about the property, and I answered them. I gave her everything she was asking for because I thought she was just interested, because I thought that was what it looked like when someone was becoming part of a family." His jaw tightened. "I was handing her a map and I didn't even know it. Richard, I'm not asking you to make me feel better about it," he said firmly, but without heat. "I just need to say it out loud. I need to hear myself say it so I can stop carrying it around like a secret." He looked at me steadily. "I was careless with something Dad built. I need to own that." I held his gaze. "All right," I said, "own it, and then put it down." He looked at me for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted, not resolution exactly, but the beginning of it. The first thin layer of something solid forming over something that had been liquid and unstable for a very long time. "Chloe," he said, turning to his sister, "I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. Years ago, when I knew you had doubts about her, and I told you that you were being uncharitable." Chloe uncurled herself from the armchair and crossed the room and sat down on the couch beside her brother and put her head on his shoulder, the way she had when she was 6 years old and he was 9, and the world had felt too large for one person to navigate alone. "You were in love," she said simply. "That's not stupidity. That's just being human." Richard put his arm around his sister, and they sat like that, the two of them in the firelight in the house their father had built on a rocky stretch of the Maine coast 30 years ago for exactly this kind of evening. The hard ones and the quiet ones, the ones where the family needed somewhere solid to stand. I watched my children and felt something settle in my chest that I had no adequate word for. Not happiness exactly, something older and quieter than happiness. The particular piece of a person who has fought for something worth fighting for and has come out the other side with the important things still intact. Outside the Atlantic moved in the dark below the cliff, patient and enormous and completely unbothered. Bill, I thought. Look what we built. Thanksgiving morning came in cold and clear, the way the best Maine mornings do. Sky the color of pale blue china air, sharp enough to make your eyes water the moment you stepped outside. I was up at 5:30. I always am, and I suspect I always will be, because 32 years of teaching first-period English to 14-year-olds rewires something permanent in the human nervous system. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the darkness over Casco Bay slowly dissolve into gray, then pink, then that particular luminous gold that belongs exclusively to November mornings on the coast. Chloe arrived at 8:15, her car loaded with groceries and a Dutch oven she had borrowed from her apartment in Boston. She came through the front door, stamping her boots on the matte cheeks, flushed from the cold, her dark hair pulled back in the same messy bun she had worn since she was 16 years old. "It's freezing," she announced as though this were new information. "It's November," I said. "In Maine," she said, "which is different from November everywhere else." She set her bags on the counter and wrapped her arms around me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder the way she used to when she was small. I covered her hands with mine, and we stayed like that for a moment, looking out at the gray-silver water together. "Is he coming?" she asked quietly. "He said he was," I replied. "He called last night to confirm." Chloe squeezed my hands once then, let go, and started unpacking groceries. "Good," she said, with the careful neutrality of a person who has more feelings about something than they are prepared to express at 8:15 in the morning. Richard arrived at 10:40, driving a truck I didn't recognize, a sensible dark green thing that looked like it had been chosen for practicality rather than impression. He parked at the bottom of the drive and sat in the cab for a moment before getting out, and I watched him from the window without moving, giving him whatever time he needed. When he finally climbed out, he was wearing the old canvas jacket, the brown one, with the worn elbows that had belonged to Bill. I had given it to Richard 6 years ago, thinking Bill would have wanted him to have it. Seeing it on him now on this particular morning made my throat close so fast I had to press my fingers against my lips and breathe through my nose until the feeling passed. He knocked on the front door, even though he had grown up walking through it without knocking, and I understood the gesture. He was asking permission in his own quiet way, asking whether he still belonged here. I opened the door before he finished the second knock. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice was careful. His eyes were careful. He had lost weight since the summer, and there were new lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there before, lines that come from a different kind of living than the one he had been doing. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Come in out of the cold." He stepped inside and I pulled him into a hug before either of us could say anything else that might make the moment more awkward than it needed to be. He stiffened for just a second, the reflex of a person who has been bracing for something painful, and then he exhaled and hugged me back properly, his arms tight around my shoulders. I felt his chest shudder once, just once. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said into my shoulder, his voice low and cracked at the edges. "I know," I said. "I know you are. I should have, Richard." I pulled back and held his face in both hands, the way I had when he was 4 years old and had fallen off his bicycle and was trying very hard not to cry. We are not going to spend today cataloging everything that should have happened differently. We don't have enough hours, and your sister made an extraordinary amount of food. He laughed a short surprise sound, more air than actual laughter, but it was real. It was the first real laugh I had heard from him in months, and it landed somewhere in my chest, like a small warm light switching on. From the kitchen, Chloe called out, I can hear you talking about my cooking, and I need you both to know I'm choosing to take it as a compliment. We ate early, the three of us, at the old round table by the window, the same table where Richard had done his homework for 16 years, where Chloe had learned to play chess, where Bill and I had sat on winter evenings with the newspaper and the particular comfortable quiet of two people who have run out of things to say and discovered it doesn't matter. Richard ate 2 full plates and half of a third. I took that as the most encouraging sign of the entire morning. Afterward, while Chloe washed up and declared herself exempt from all further physical labor for the remainder of the day, Richard and I put on our coats and drove the 40 minutes north along the coast road to the Clipper Lighthouse. He was quiet for most of the drive. Not an uncomfortable quiet, the kind that comes from a person who is assembling their thoughts carefully, trying to find the right container for something large and complicated. About 20 minutes in, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When did you know about Bianca?" He kept his eyes on the road. "When did you actually know, not just suspect?" I thought about that for a moment. "The spring before last," I said. "When Jasper came to fix the drainage on the east side of the house and spent 45 minutes in the storage room looking at labels on file boxes." Richard's jaw tightened. "He told me it was a favor." "I know he did. I should have seen it." "You loved her," I said simply. "When you love someone, you give them the benefit of the doubt. That's not a character flaw, Richard. That's what love looks like from the inside." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It doesn't look like that anymore." "No," I agreed. "I know." We drove in silence for a while. The coast road curved north and the ocean opened up on the left, wide and pewter-colored under the November sky, the kind of sea that looks like it has been there since before everything else and will be there long after. "Dad used to say the ocean doesn't care about your problems," Richard said. "He said that was the point of it." "He did say that," I confirmed, usually while standing in front of it with a cup of coffee looking extremely pleased with himself. Richard made a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. He wiped his eye quickly with the back of his hand, a fast, almost angry gesture, the gesture of a man who is not yet comfortable with his own tears. I pretended not to notice. He needed that. We turned off the coast road at the gravel path and drove down slowly, the tires crunching through the first light frost that still clung to the grass in the shade. The lighthouse came into view as we rounded the last curve, that familiar cedar-sided house on its granite shelf, the old light tower rising behind it, salt-weathered and permanent-looking against the pale sky. Richard leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Dad found this from a kayaks," I said. Chloe told me. He looked at it for a long moment. "It looks like something he would have found." "It looks exactly like something he would have found," I agreed. We parked and walked down to the granite shelf. The wind off the water was strong and cold, carrying that particular Atlantic smell, salt and cold stone, and something ancient underneath it all. Richard stood at the edge of the shelf and looked out, hands in the pockets of Bill's old jacket, and I stood beside him, and we didn't need to fill the moment with anything. After a while, he reached into the pocket of Bill's old jacket and took out something small. He held it in his palm and looked at it, then held it out to me. It was a flat gray stone, the kind you find on the beach below this cliff, smoothed by decades of Atlantic water. Someone had written on it in faded marker, the ink barely legible. I leaned in and read it. "For Maggie. So you always have somewhere to stand. B." My throat closed completely. I pressed the stone against my chest with both hands and could not speak for a moment, could not do anything except stand there on the granite shelf with the wind in my face and the ocean enormous below me and my son beside me in his father's jacket. "I found it in the glove box of his truck," Richard said quietly. "When I cleaned it out after. I've been carrying it ever since." He paused. "I thought it should come back here." I looked at my son. He was watching me with Bill's eyes, careful and open and entirely without armor, and I thought, there he is. There is the man his father raised. "Thank you," I said. My voice came out barely above a whisper. Richard nodded once. He put his arm around my shoulders and we stood together, the two of us looking out at the water. The light on the Atlantic had shifted from pewter to silver, and the wind was cold and steady and clean. Somewhere behind us I heard Chloe's footsteps on the granite, then her hand on my other arm. The three of us stood there without speaking, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Not yet, Bill, I thought. Not yet, but I'll tell you everything when I get there. Looking back, I realize this tragedy happened because I was too complacent tolerating evil inside my own home. Don't be like me. Don't wait until your most sacred values are threatened to wake up and fight back. God granted us the power of forgiveness, but He never told us to be weak before greedy predators. My stance is simple. Kindness without fangs is just weakness. When facing ultimate betrayal, I had to turn my silence into a shocking grandma revenge, a calculated strike to protect my family. Some might call my actions cold, but to me this was a raw revenge that those who weaponize trust absolutely deserved. The truth is, if you don't build a fortress around what you love, others will level it. This precise grandma revenge was not just about punishment. It was a harsh lesson in karma. I am proud to have executed this raw revenge with the absolute clarity of a mother. Hopefully, the warning from this intense grandma revenge and its bittersweet raw revenge will help you stand stronger in life. If this story resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel today so we can continue walking through these deep life lessons together. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Also, please note, future stories on this channel will feature modified elements structured for educational and viewing purposes. If this storytelling style does not suit your preferences, feel free to skip and explore other content.